Ben gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles whitening in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. The empty highway stretched endlessly ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the desolate landscape. It was past midnight, and the only company he had was the occasional flicker of the road signs and the rhythmic hum of his car's engine. The night drive had started as a way to clear his mind after the argument with his fiancée, Lisa. They had fought about something trivial, but it had escalated, leaving Ben with a restless urge to escape. Now, as he navigated the lonely road, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He glanced at the rearview mirror for the 100th time, half expecting to see headlights behind him. There was nothing but darkness. He laughed at himself, a nervous chuckle that filled the silence. "Get a grip, Ben," he muttered. "You're just paranoid." The road signs began to blur together, and Ben realized he needed a break. He spotted an exit sign for a small town called Hollow Creek, just 5 miles ahead. A gas station symbol on the sign promised a chance to stretch his legs and grab a cup of coffee. The exit ramp was deserted, and Ben's tires crunched on the gravel as he pulled into the gas station's lot. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. A single flickering light above the entrance cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. Ben stepped out of the car, shivering as the cold night air hit him. He glanced around, noting the boarded-up windows of nearby buildings and the overgrown weeds that choked the sidewalks. The town seemed abandoned, a relic of a bygone era. Inside the gas station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the rows of dusty shelves. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes following Ben as he approached. "Evening," Ben said, forcing a smile. "Do you have any coffee?" The old man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving Ben. "Over there," he said, pointing to a corner where an ancient coffee machine sat. Ben filled a styrofoam cup, the stale scent of burnt coffee filling his nostrils. He took a sip and grimaced, but it was better than nothing. He turned to the old man, trying to make conversation. "Quiet night, Pa." The old man's expression remained unchanged. "Too quiet," he replied. "You're not from around here, are you?" "No," Ben admitted. "Just passing through." The old man nodded again, as if he had expected that answer. "Be careful on the road," he said, his voice low. "Strange things happen around here at night." Ben felt a chill run down his spine. He paid for the coffee and left, the old man's words echoing in his mind. Back in the car, he took a deep breath and started the engine. The road ahead seemed darker than before, and the sense of unease lingered. As he drove through Hollow Creek, he noticed something strange. The streetlights flickered and dimmed as he passed, casting brief shadows that danced along the buildings. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A figure darted across the road, disappearing into the shadows. Ben slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He peered into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the whisper of the wind. He took a shaky breath and continued driving, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of the mysterious figure. The farther he went, the more oppressive the darkness seemed to become. The trees on either side of the road closed in, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated a sign up ahead. "Road closed." Ben cursed under his breath and pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. He reached for his phone to check the map, but there was no signal. "Great," he muttered. He stepped out of the car, hoping to find a detour. As he examined the sign, he heard a noise behind him. A rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. "Hello," he called out, his voice wavering. There was no response, just the rustling growing louder. Ben's heart raced as he turned, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. And then he saw them, eyes reflecting the dim light of his car's headlights. Dozens of them, watching him from the shadows. Ben backed away slowly, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He stumbled and fell, the rough pavement scraping his hands and knees. As he scrambled to his feet, the eyes seemed to move closer, the rustling growing louder. He bolted for the car, fumbling with the door handle before finally wrenching it open. He jumped inside, slamming the door and locking it. The eyes were gone. The night was silent once more. Ben sat there, his heart pounding, trying to make sense of what he had seen. He knew he had to get out of there, but the road was closed, and there was no signal on his phone. He took a deep breath and put the car in reverse, intending to find another way out of Hollow Creek. As he backed up, his headlights caught something in the road, a figure standing perfectly still. Ben's blood ran cold as he recognized the old man from the gas station. The old man raised a hand, pointing directly at Ben. Ben didn't wait to find out what he wanted. He slammed the car into drive and sped away, the tires screeching on the pavement. As he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the old man standing in the middle of the road, watching him disappear into the night. Ben drove faster than he ever had before, the narrow road winding through the dense forest. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and his mind raced with questions. What was that back there? Who was the old man, and why was he following him? The road ahead forked, and Ben took a sharp left, hoping it would lead him back to the main highway. The trees loomed closer, their branches scraping against the car like skeletal fingers. The darkness seemed to press in on him, suffocating and relentless. After what felt like an eternity, Ben saw a faint glow ahead. Streetlights. Relief washed over him as he emerged from the forest onto a broader road. He slowed down, taking deep breaths to calm his racing heart. He wasn't out of the woods yet, but at least he was back on familiar ground. He drove through another small town, this one with a few signs of life. A diner with neon lights, a motel, a convenience store. Ben pulled into the convenience store's parking lot and parked near the entrance. He needed a moment to collect his thoughts and decide his next move. Inside the store, the fluorescent lights were harsh and glaring. Ben grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter, where a young woman with tired eyes was flipping through a magazine. "Rough night?" she asked, glancing up at him. "You have no idea," Ben replied, managing a weak smile. "Do you know the quickest way to get back to the highway?" "Yeah, take a right at the next intersection and follow the signs. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes," she said. Ben thanked her and paid for the water. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "Hey, have you ever heard of a place called Hollow Creek?" The woman's expression changed, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Hollow Creek? That's a ghost town. No one goes there anymore." "Why not?" Ben asked, his curiosity piqued despite his fear. "There are stories," she said, lowering her voice. "People disappearing, strange sightings. It's best to stay away." Ben nodded, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He left the store and got back into his car, determined to follow the woman's directions and get as far away from Hollow Creek as possible. The road signs were clear, and Ben soon found himself back on the highway. The familiar hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road began to soothe his nerves. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost 3 a.m. Lissa would be worried sick by now. He reached for his phone to call her, but there was still no signal. As he drove, the events of the night replayed in his mind. The eerie gas station, the eyes in the darkness, the old man. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something he wasn't seeing. But right now, all he wanted was to get home and put this nightmare behind him. Miles passed, and the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Ben's eyelids grew heavy, exhaustion finally catching up with him. He decided to pull over at the next rest stop and catch a few hours of sleep before continuing his journey. He spotted a rest area sign and exited the highway, pulling into a quiet parking lot surrounded by trees. He reclined his seat and closed his eyes, letting out a long sigh. The tension slowly melted away, and he drifted off to sleep. A loud bang jolted him awake. Ben sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The parking lot was empty, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. And then he saw it, a note, pinned under his windshield wiper. He opened the door and stepped out, his hands trembling as he retrieved the note. The paper was old and yellowed, the handwriting shaky and uneven. "Stay away from Hollow Creek. You've been warned." Ben's blood ran cold. He looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The rest area was eerily silent. He crumpled the note in his hand and got back into the car, locking the doors behind him. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, his mind racing with questions. Who had left the note? How had they found him? The warning echoed in his mind as he sped down the highway, the morning sun rising behind him. As he drove, he vowed never to return to Hollow Creek. The town held too many secrets, too many dangers. He just hoped he could leave it all behind and move on with his life. But deep down, Ben knew that some things could never be forgotten. The darkness of that night, the eyes watching from the shadows, the old man's haunting gaze. They would stay with him forever, a chilling reminder of the night drive that had changed everything. Tony had always found a strange comfort in the solitude of night drives. The rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt, the occasional flicker of headlights from distant cars, and the blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow the world outside his windshield created a cocoon of isolation. Tonight, however, the drive felt different. An inexplicable tension hung in the air, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He had left the city hours ago, heading towards the small town where he grew up. The route was familiar, but the deserted country roads took on a sinister quality under the moonless sky. Tony's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as he tried to shake off the unease. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing by the roadside, thumb extended in the universal gesture for a ride. Tony hesitated for a moment, then pulled over. The figure, a young woman in a worn leather jacket, approached the car. "Need a lift?" Tony asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, thanks," she replied, her voice barely audible over the idling engine. She climbed into the passenger seat, and Tony pulled back onto the road. "I'm Tony," he said, glancing over at her. "Emily," she replied, her eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. She didn't offer any more information, and Tony didn't press her. They drove in silence for a while, the tension between them growing with each passing mile. "Where are you headed?" Tony finally asked, breaking the silence. "Just up ahead," Emily said vaguely. "I'll let you know when we get there." As they continued driving, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He checked the rearview mirror frequently, half expecting to see headlights behind them, but the road remained empty. Suddenly, Emily stiffened in her seat. "Stop the car," she said urgently. Tony complied, pulling over to the side of the road. "What's wrong?" he asked, his heart racing. "There's something I need to show you," Emily said, her voice trembling. She pointed to a narrow dirt path barely visible in the darkness. "Follow that path. It's important." Against his better judgment, Tony turned onto the dirt path. The car's headlights revealed a dense forest on either side, the trees casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance in the periphery of his vision. The path twisted and turned, becoming narrower with each passing minute. "Stop here," Emily instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. Tony stopped the car and cut the engine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Emily opened her door and stepped out, gesturing for Tony to follow. He hesitated but finally climbed out of the car, curiosity and fear battling within him. Emily led him a short distance into the woods, stopping at a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and foreboding. "What's this place?" Tony asked, his voice shaky. "Something terrible happened here," Emily said, her eyes fixed on the cabin, "and I need your help to make it right." Tony felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Emily turned to face him, her expression grave. "Years ago, a man disappeared from this town. People said he just up and left, but I know better. He was my brother, and he was taken. I've been trying to find out what happened to him ever since." Tony stared at her, disbelief and fear warring within him. "Why do you need me?" "Because you're the only one who stopped," Emily said simply. "And because I think I finally know where he is." Tony stood frozen, his mind racing with questions. "What do you mean you know where he is?" he asked, his voice tinged with panic. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the cabin. "I did some digging, and I found out that this cabin was owned by a man named Harris. He was a recluse, but people in town whispered that he was involved in some dark stuff. My brother was investigating him before he disappeared." Tony felt a knot form in his stomach. "And you think he's here?" Emily nodded. "I think he might be. Or at least I think we might find some answers inside." Tony glanced at the cabin, its decaying facade looming ominously in the moonlight. Every instinct told him to turn around and leave, but something in Emily's eyes compelled him to stay. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Let's go." They approached the cabin cautiously, the wooden steps creaking under their weight. The door was slightly ajar, and Tony pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the floor. Emily led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior of the cabin was a mess, with old furniture strewn about and papers scattered on the floor. Tony's heart pounded as they moved deeper into the cabin, every creak and groan of the wood making him jump. In a back room, they found a trapdoor leading to a basement. Emily's hand shook as she reached for the handle, but Tony stopped her. "Let me go first," he said, his voice firm. Emily nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. Tony descended the rickety stairs, the flashlight illuminating a small, cramped space. The basement was filled with strange symbols and markings on the walls, and in the center of the room was a large old chest. Tony's pulse quickened as he approached it. He knelt down and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, he found a collection of old books, bizarre artifacts, and most disturbingly, a series of photographs. The pictures were of different people, all of them looking terrified, bound and gagged. Among them, he recognized Emily's brother. "Emily, come down here," Tony called, his voice shaking. Emily hurried down the stairs, her eyes widening in horror as she saw the photographs. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Tony continued to search through the chest, his hands trembling. He found a journal, its pages filled with cryptic notes and descriptions of rituals. As he flipped through the pages, a sense of dread settled over him. "This guy was into some seriously messed up stuff," Tony said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here and take this to the authorities." Emily nodded, her face pale. "You're right. Let's go." They hurried up the stairs and out of the cabin, their hearts pounding with fear. As they reached the car, Tony heard a rustling in the trees. He turned, but saw nothing. "Come on, let's get out of here," Emily urged, her voice trembling. They climbed into the car and sped away, the dark forest swallowing the cabin behind them. Tony's mind raced with the horrors they had uncovered, but he knew they had to get help. As they drove back towards town, Tony couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind them was empty. Still, the sense of unease lingered, a reminder of the nightmarish discovery they had made. Emily sat silently beside him, clutching the journal to her chest. Tony knew that their ordeal was far from over, but for now, they were safe. They had escaped the darkness of the cabin, but its shadows would haunt them for a long time to come.